Welcome back. Well, let's get right into our conversations of today. We saw those numbers coming from the United States, and we've seen how markets are reacting, global oil, and especially reacting to that inflation and the thoughts that the Fed will continue hiking rates. But anyway, let's get more on this from Dumebi. She's here now, Dumebi Oluwole. Good morning. Thank you for your time, Dumebi.
Thank you.
So we know that the target for the United States inflation is 2%, but they're still at 4.9%, a long way from the target, and the world is having to suffer from it.
Well, essentially what this points to is that the U.S. Fed might, want to continue its rate hikes, even though it will be less aggressive, because inflation did fall, right? Even though it was very marginal.
Yeah, from 4.95
to 4.9%, but still, it points to the fact that the rate hikes are beginning to, or at least making some progress to cool inflationary pressures. However, the main focus for the U.S. Fed is usually the core inflation numbers, and that's because it's inflation less, volatile commodities like food and energy. So that tells you, it just shows the underlying inflationary pressures that are still potent in the economy. And because that hasn't, really declined, it just eased by, I think, 5.5 to 5.3%. So it's still pretty much, above where the U.S. Fed would like it to get to, and it didn't decline by so much. So at 5.5% or 5.3%, core inflation is still very important, indicating that inflationary pressures in the U.S. are still high. But there are other things that point to the fact that inflationary pressures could begin to decline, and that's because, especially core inflation, that's because things like shelter costs actually fell. We're already getting to spring, so some level of, so we could begin to see a decline in energy demand, and that's just because, typically energy demand, when it's the winter season, we see a high increase in demand for energy products. But because we're getting to spring, getting to summer period, we could see that decline. So these are some of the things that the U.S. Fed will be, considering before either hiking rates or leaving things be for the time being. And the reason why they might even consider increasing rates is just because they're trying to the goal right now is to do whatever it takes to, simply
get to that 2%.
Yes, get to 2%.
Is that possible? It's still a long way away. 4.9 and 2%.
Well, even though it's still a long there's still some gap, in between. The truth of the matter is that the monetary policy transmission mechanism in the U.S. is really strong. And why I say that is because once there's an increase in interest rates, once there's an increase in the anchor rate or the U.S. Fed's fund rate, you see an immediate increase in other government securities, like bonds, treasury bills, and you see the markets react. Essentially, mortgage rates also increase. So it tells you how strong the monetary policy transmission mechanism is, and with time we should begin to see all of this take effect to simply cool inflationary pressures. But on the flip side of it is continuous hike rates will continue to fuel.
It's a threat of recession.
Exactly. It continues to fuel recessionary
pressure because demand squeezes.
Exactly, and cost of borrowing also increases, right? So, and apart from that, the banking crisis that has been happening is also not making things any easier. So, earlier this week we saw almost a complete shift to safe haven assets. The price of gold increased to a record high. So clearly we're seeing markets respond in diverse ways, right? So even when inflation data came out, to one extent, some investors, were encouraged that, okay, with this slight decline, just maybe the U.S. Fed might halt, its increase in rates for some time before now taking it back up again if inflationary pressures seem like they're not cooling. So, and we saw bond yields actually increase to that effect, but we also saw gold prices increase. So, meaning that market reactions are very, very different too.
But the U.S. also has that debt limits to also either default or increase its debt limit. Of course, the Republicans are not having that, but we know that at the end of the day, the U.S., the Republicans, the Democrats, at the end of the day, it might take a while, but they normally would just compromise for the good of the country, But how do you see this ending?
I mean, it's the U.S. we're talking about.
Not Nigeria.
It's the U.S. So definitely there will be a quick resolve. And that's because this is not the first time the debt ceiling has been increased, right? And the goal oftentimes is just to ensure that there's no default.
What are the risks, you know?
Yeah, so the two scenarios are if the debt ceiling is not increased and the U.S. defaults on it, which is highly unlikely, if that happens, you know, just the same way it would have an impact on the Nigerian economy, it's just the same way, you know, it will have an impact on the U.S. economy. So it just simply means that the U.S.
Who is going to rate them junk? Because
well, I mean, maybe not junk. Of course not junk.
Not junk, but at least you know the rating should reduce because if you default, that's one of the consequences.
Well, like I said, it's the U.S. So the chances of that happening are slim.
JP Morgan is the US, Fitch is in the US. These are the guys who do the rating.
But I mean, coming from when the financial crisis started, this was one of the reasons why they made credit rating agencies stand alone. They're independent of any government influence, any political influence. So essentially, they are like the backbone of the economy and the financial, you know, system of any country or the central bank itself. So essentially, what this means is that whether or not they default or it doesn't change. It wouldn't. The credit rating agencies are not moved by all of this. Do you understand? If it requires that the US the rating is downgraded, we will definitely see that. And why? Because they always have talks with governments before these ratings are done or before these ratings are announced. So if there are chances that the debt ceiling would probably be increased and the US, maybe the US actually commits to, you know, covering some of these debts in the meantime, you know, we might see that, they would come out, say, we're rating it stable, and it's just because these plans have been put in place to ensure that, to ensure that the US doesn't default on its debt. We could also see that they would say, we're rating the US down, and this is because of this and this and this. But like we always say, it's the US. There are certain things that we expect.
When you say that, you know, it just paints another picture in my mind.
No, it's because it's the truth, right? This is the dominant economy in the world today, right? A lot of countries' external reserves are pegged to the US dollar. Things like this would affect the value of the US dollar, and it has significant implications for other countries. There are a lot of things to consider.
We're out of time maybe, but just briefly, now how does all of this tie into the commodity space? How does it affect the commodity space?
Well, let's just look at the inflation.
I know you talked about gold earlier.
Yes, exactly. So inflation generally, if the US Fed continues to hike rates, for Nigeria, what that simply means is that we would, number one, be exposed to a decline in oil prices. We've seen oil prices fall from the $80 benchmark already, and this simply means lower oil revenues for the economy. Then there's also the monetary aspect of it, that because the US Fed is going to continue, because the US Fed might increase their interest rates again, the CBN will have to continue to do that to mirror, you know, these rate hikes to continue to woo investors and keep stabilize the currency peg to the US dollar to avoid speculative dumping of the naira, right? So these are some of the things that could happen. Essentially, all commodity prices right now, we're seeing seasonality take its full effect. We're in the planting season for a lot of commodities, and we're also in the harvest season for some. So, for example, tomato prices, we've seen that tomato prices are really high, and that's just because, you know, of there's pest disease that's really ravaging tomato harvest right now. There's also the fact that supply is really low, and there's also the planting, you know, effect also happening there. So there are lots of things happening. Commodity prices are mixed generally, but essentially, compared to last year, prices are still, you know, very much higher than what they were before.
All right, thank you so much, Dumebi Oluwole, Senior Analyst with Financial Derivatives Company, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a breather. When we come back, we'll be celebrating 15 years of G-Tex Homes. Join us after then.